I don't speak your language, so this lecture will be in English. That's not a problem. Cool, you are pretty awesome. Everyone here speaks English. It's quite impressive, at least compared to Hungary. So I'm very happy to be invited here, and I will be speaking about an important aspect and a quite interesting aspect of Chinese culture, that is the search for immortality, the Chinese version of search for immortality. And I want you to feel free to ask, if you want to ask any questions, if you don't understand something I'm saying. I will be going over a lot of things, so just absolutely feel free to stop me, to ask a question, ask me to clarify something, or if you have something to add. So feel free to make this panel interactive. I think we can even give you some microphones if someone wants to pose a question. So really feel free to stop me and ask anything if you don't understand something. Okay, so the path without death, the 无事之道, as it is in Chinese, is basically the search for immortality in China. And before going to China, I would like to talk about the topic a bit to compare within the Western culture. So, yeah, okay, before we talk about the Western culture, just to introduce you to the topic. This is a story from the Warring States period of China, that is between the 5th century to the 3rd century before Common Era. When China was divided into 7 major states who were waging wars in order to unify China. So one of the Chinese states, Yan, the state of Yan, this is where modern Peking is. So this is basically the northeastern part of China. And there was a ruler here, and he heard that somewhere in his kingdom there lives a sage who knows the way of immortality, the way without death. So the Lord of Yan sent an envoy to find this sage and bring this sage to him, because he of course wanted to attain immortality. So the envoy was sent, but he was quite slow to travel, and when he arrived, the sage who knew the way of immortality was already dead. Yes, it's a bit ironic. And the Lord of Yan was pretty angry at the envoy, because he was so slow and he couldn't procure this man, this sage, so he wanted to execute the poor envoy for being so slow. And thankfully, there was a wise minister who argued with the king. And of course, what he said is along the lines of what you noticed, that if someone really knew the way of immortality, why would he die? And what the sage said is that there is no thing that the humans fear more than death. And there is no thing that the humans desire more than immortality. So if the sage really knew the secret of immortality, of course he would have applied it to himself, and he wouldn't have died. So the story ends up with a happy end, and the envoy is not executed, because the king was convinced by this argument. So this is an amusing story, of course, and it's a bit ironic, as you noted, that someone who knows immortality could die. Yes, so it also shows the Chinese interest in immortality, that they were deeply interested in it, kings and sages alike. And there is of course to us this story is quite absurd. I mean, of course there's the irony, and of course we think that it's natural that such a story doesn't end up with immortality being found. Because in the Western culture, the search for immortality is quite stigmatized. The whole search for immortality, the pursuit of immortality, is a hubris, it's a sin, it's a taboo topic, but it's only in the West this way. So in the Western civilization, this negative attitude toward anyone who is trying to reach immortality is a very old one. Do you know what is basically the oldest story of the world. I mean, the oldest story in the world that we still know of. Yes, the Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And one of the central themes of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the search for immortality, when Gilgamesh, in the last half of the epic, tries to attain immortality and he fails. So, yes, I put in the anime version of Gilgamesh as well, just for a bit of fun. Yeah, it's a good question, I don't think so. Probably he was more of a Middle Eastern guy.
No, I mean, the design, also for the
yeah, of course, it's from one of the animes, from Fate Stay Night, so... Well, Japanese love old people, I think that's the whole point of it. So anyway, what we have is the story of Gilgamesh, and when Enkidu, his best friend, dies, he is a bit frightened by that, and he talks to the spirit of Enkidu and he learns what's going on down there in the underworld, and it's all very bleak, and he's not really excited by dying. So he decides to attain immortality. And one of his ancestors is Utnapishtim, which basically he is the original Noe. I mean, the story of the Ark of Noe comes from Mesopotamian mythology, and there it's Utnapishtim who was the guy with the big ark where he saved all the animals. And Utnapishtim was rewarded with immortality, but he was lived far away from civilization in a mythical place, far over the mountains and everything. So Gilgamesh decides to visit him to learn the trick of immortality, and he fails twice. First, Utnapishtim says that, okay, if you can go on without sleeping for 7 days, then you will attain immortality. And Gilgamesh says, okay, it's not a big deal, and he sits down and falls asleep for 7 days instantly. So he kind of fails it, and then he learns another way to attain the grass of immortality. It's on the bottom of a lake. He gets this magical herb, but then a snake steals it. So twice he fails at attaining immortality, and the conclusion of the epic is that only by building a lasting legacy, that is the stone walls of Uruk, is the only way humans can realistically achieve immortality, but not in the way of really attaining immortality, as in living forever. So this is very old, there's a very old tradition in Western culture of being negative of anyone who pursues immortality, and of course it goes through the Greek culture, where immortality wasn't a big topic, but hubris was. And most of the Greeks' myths are about showing that if humans overreach, then they will fall down and face the consequences. And there is, of course, a strong taboo against the search for immortality in the Jewish tradition, as in the Garden of Eden. It's also Yahweh is quite a jealous God. And if you read the book of Genesis, and for a moment you forget the Christian reinterpretation of it, the text is quite clear that God banished Adam and Eve, not because they disobeyed him, there is no issue of morality there. God banished them because he was afraid that they would attain immortality as well. So it's an act of jealousy on part of the God, and that's why Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. Of course, Christians later try to reinterpret it as some kind of a moral story with disobedience and such thing, but that's not in the original text. So, in various stages of Western civilization, there's a strong taboo against search for immortality. So, if you have a king who is searching for immortality, then he is probably a bad guy. He's either mad, an insane ruler, or some bad tyrant. So that's in stories, it's a very powerful tool. If you want to signal that a given ruler is a bad ruler, you tell him that he's searching for immortality. So if you read not specifically the Lord of the Rings, but if you remember the story of Numenor in the Lord of the Rings, they was punished and they fell because they wanted immortality. And yes, but Sauron got the deal by promising them immortality. Yeah, so he said that if you conquer Valinor, you will attain immortality. So again, we see that search for immortality is the way to damnation, basically the story. So this is a very old topos in Western civilization. And what is quite interesting is that it's absolutely not so in China. There is no stigma in China attached to immortality. On the contrary, it's sages and good kings should try to pursue immortality. It's absolutely a respectable and sensible way of trying to advance human civilization in a sense. So there is no taboo, there is no hubris, it's not a sin, there is nothing wrong with someone trying to attain immortality in the Chinese culture, and of course that also means Korea and Japan, because those are heavily influenced by the Chinese culture. So one good example of that is the Wan Sui, the traditional greeting of a Chinese emperor, and also the Japanese adopted this, is Wan Sui, which means 10,000 years. Sui means years as years of age of a person, for example. So Wan Sui means may you live for 10,000 years. And that's, in Japanese, is translated to Banzai, the quite famous battle cry also used in the Second World War. But Banzai is the traditional greeting of the emperor. So as you see, the search for immortality was absolutely accepted in the Chinese cultural sphere. So any questions so far? No? Okay, so how did the Chinese wanted to achieve immortality? That's the... Okay, so the question was, if you didn't hear, is that why was it a sin in the Western civilization? That's a very, very complicated question. It's it's quite complicated because this raises a question: are there fundamental differences between the Chinese culture and the Western culture? And there are scholars who like to point out crucial differences, and there are scholars who like to say that human culture is basically made of the same things but in different combinations. So it's quite, there are some scholarly research done on this topic, and it's quite hotly debated. Those who like to say that there are fundamental characteristics of different civilizations like to say that Chinese imagine the sphere of humanity and the sphere of the divine as inherently harmonious, while the Western civilization imagine the sphere of humanity and the sphere of the gods as inherently hostile toward each other. So in Chinese it's pretty natural to think that there is men can become gods and gods can descend to live with man, and there is a lot of transition going on between the sphere of the mortal and the sphere of the divine, while in Western civilization there is usually a very strict division between the two and a lot of hostility. For example, I mentioned the Mesopotamian Noe mythology, that the flood, the demiurge, when and the Mesopotamian story says that the gods were simply annoyed by the humans because they were too noisy. So the great gods decided to wipe out humanity in a flood because they were too noisy. So it shows you the level of hostility, how they imagined the world of man and the world of gods to be. And some scholars say that this is why immortality was quite acceptable for the Chinese and why it became regarded as a sin in the Western religions. But of course there are always exceptions to such grand categorizations, so it's a complicated question, but I think I answered the bulk of it. Yeah, it's not an easy question and there's no consensus on it. So, the Chinese wanted to attain immortality, and there were a lot of occult practices on the topic. The first text we know appeared in the 4th century before Common Era, and that's pretty early. That's pretty early. Now, I know probably, I don't know which, anyone have read a bit about Chinese culture? Anyone interested in Chinese culture here? Okay, like anyone practicing martial arts here? A few, okay, not much. So, you might have read a lot of things about Chinese civilization being 5,000 years old, and a lot of inventions being dated to the 3rd century before Common Era. Now, that's mostly not true, right? There is some truth in it, but it's mostly untrue. Chinese, just like any nation, have practiced had the good practice of the more they thought about history, the more they invented for the earlier phases. So when the Chinese saying that this was invented in the 3rd century BC, they're usually referring to mythical heroes whom they placed in the timeline. But this is not real history. So the real history of China goes, metal and bronze appeared in the early 2nd millennium BCE, so around the 19th, 18th century, maybe the 17th century. So in a sense, Chinese civilization is a millennia younger than the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian. That's important to know. And the first writings we have from China are actually from the late Shang dynasty, from the Anyang period. They are from the 13th century only. So the 13th century, that's from ancient ways, is pretty late actually. And that's when we have the first writings. Of course, by that time we have a completely evolved writing system. So probably they had writing from an earlier time, we just don't have any archaeological remains. So the Chinese were in Bronze Age for around the 8th century BCE, and they adopted the Iron Age afterwards that. It's a question whether it's relevant or not, I mean the interest of iron. But it shows you that the 4th century BCE was already pretty much the formative stage of Chinese civilization. So Confucius is usually dated to the late 5th, early 4th century by realistic datings. So 4th century BCE was really the beginning of Chinese philosophy, of the Chinese, many things that we consider normal about the Chinese civilization just evolved around that time. That was the Warring States period. So that's pretty early in the Chinese history. And so they had various practices to attain immortality. Some of these were like exercises. There were already a lot of breathing exercises. And that remained a long time. So you might know that many martial arts, especially Japanese ones, like to make big shouts when they fight, the so-called kiai shouts. These are related to breathing exercises and how to manipulate the body with breathing. So that's pretty ancient. And of course there were a lot of practices, the meditation and things like that. So they had all these, and they said that if you follow these, you can become immortal, you can become like a spirit, you can see the future without divination, that's a funny thing, and you can fly. And no, not like Superman, flying is usually considered as a shamanistic aspect, so, because shamans are said to fly to the upper world, usually by some mind-affecting substance, by consuming some mind-affecting substance. Even alcohol can work, and a lot of drugs as well are used in shamanistic practices. So that's why flying is usually associated with shamanism. So pretty early we have this idea of wanting to become immortal. And how to achieve that, there were several ideas. One of the most prominent one is the chi, or in Japanese it's called the ki. Who have heard about the chi or ki? Okay, pretty much a few. There is a lot of misconceptions because this is a very difficult concept. One, I would like to say that it is often said that it's kind of a life force or life energy. It is not. I mean, not in the sense of energy, because that's a term that's very Western. That's actually not how the Chinese thought about. Qi was, first of all, considered something like a fog. So like something that's material but very, very light, very gaseous form of material. And they saw that qi condenses into solid forms, and everything is made up of qi. Another meaning of qi was anger. So, yes, it's like the dark side of the force. Channel your anger. Even today in Chinese, if someone gets angry, they say shang qi, that is give birth to qi. And anger was also the sense of qi as the martial spirit of an army. So, for example, the ancient Chinese thought that if an army was really ready to fight, they really had a high morale, then they would emit a lot of qi. And if you had metal bells, and you know, when it's cold, the moisture from the air can condense on the metal, and small droplets of water appear on metal when it's cold. So they thought that if the enemy army is really high morale, they could determine this by setting out metal bells, and there was a lot of water condensed on the metal, then the enemy army is really willing to fight and maybe we should retreat. And if the enemy army didn't have a lot of qi, then there would be no metal, water condensing on the metal bells, so we should attack them. That was one of the kind of divinations Chinese tried to do before battles. So yeah, it might sound silly, but it was based on the idea that qi is a foggish thing, and qi is also the martial anger. And it's also the basic building material of the world. So there was also a lot of, the concept of qi developed for 2.5 millennia. So there's a lot of ideas about how qi works. But one very popular idea was that there are different kinds of qi. And that's where we are getting close to immortality, because it was said, who has heard about yin and yang? Okay, so there's a basic duality in Chinese thinking, and yang is the masculine, the white, the light, the active, and yin is the feminine, the passive, is the earth, is the one that yields, accepts, changes shape, etc. So there's yin and yang, and there is also yin and yang qi. And the idea was that light, qi, belongs to yang and to the heaven, and yin qi is heavy, it belongs to the earth. And humans are composed of the combination of these. And if we can replace our yin qi with yang qi, for example by breathing exercises, if I can breathe in only yang qi and I can breathe out all the yin qi, then after a few decades of doing this, I will replace all the qi in my body with purely yang qi, and that would mean that I will be like heaven, I will be lightweight, I will simply float up to heaven, and I also be immortal, like things in heaven, because yang is the heavenly material. So that's the idea what they thought back in the ancient times of how you can achieve immortality by breathing exercises, by manipulating what kind of qi your body is composed of. So, anyone interested in trying that out? Yeah? Okay. So, that's just one example of how they sought to do that. Another way to immortality is much more similar to the Gilgamesh epic, is the herb of immortality, or grass or plant of immortality, which is, based on the descriptions, it's some kind of mushroom, probably the fly agaric, which, as you know, is quite poisonous. It's quite poisonous, and but it's quite popular usage in Central Asia, and it also appears in Indian mythology as the drink of the gods, the soma. So, who knows how fly agaric was used in shamanistic cultures?
I know, but the case is that some mushrooms were used by the berserkers,
Yes, it is also said that the Norsemen, berserkers, also used that. So, who has read American Gods from Neil Gaiman? Few. You might remember there is a small story there about a Siberian tribe moving over to America. And what Neil Gaiman described is a real-life practice of shamanists in Siberia. What they did is that the shaman or the smith, someone with a strong physical ability, consumed the mushroom, and they nearly died because it's poisonous. But their body processed the poison, and basically they urinated the rest, so what they pissed out was free of poison, but still had the hallucinogenic components there. And basically what the tribe did is they drank the piss of the shaman after he ate the poisonous mushrooms. So they were spared the poison, but they had the drug. So they could go high altogether, the tribe, as one happy unit of hippies, or in this case, Mongolian, I don't know, horse nomads. So yes, that was a practice. And who have read Frank Herbert's Dune, or watched the movie or one of them? Okay, a few of you. If you remember the water of life, what Herbert does is basically he uses the same thing, that you have the reverence mothers who are able to turn the poisonous water of life, water of death, into this hallucinogenic spiritual drink that then the whole tribe drinks together. But Herbert didn't want to shock his audience by saying that the Reverend Mother eats it and then pisses it out, and that's what everyone else drinks. So he said that there is a catalyst effect that goes back from his throat to the vessel where the water is. But basically what Herbert did was he used this same shamanistic procedure. So there is also appears in the Chinese ways to achieve immortality. And there were of course a lot of stories about that this herb of immortality only grows in the Eastern Ocean on the island of immortals, and then the first emperor, wanting to achieve immortality, sent a ship there, but they said that only children should be on the crew of the ship because that's only how they will be entered to reach this island. And there are a lot of legends and crazy things like that. So that was, for example, another way to achieve immortality. And there were a few other theories. Now this whole thing became quite popular, of course. Who doesn't want to become immortal? So there started to develop a large literature about immortals, and it reached a stage when I said the first text about reaching immortality appeared in the 4th century before Common Era, and by the 4th century Common Era we have a book of the biography of immortals, and there was collections of various stories about immortals. There were even interviews with immortals there, and there was also a classification of immortals. Now, what subclasses of immortals do we have? Well, they classified immortals based on how they achieved immortality. Any ideas of those classes? No? Okay, well, as I said, one of the basic ideas was that if you replace all the chi of your body with yang chi, you will be immortal and you will be also very lightweight. So they said that the best type of immortals are those who have become so full of yang chi that they basically floated off from the center of the town. They just flied up to heaven because their body was so full of yang chi. Now the second group of immortals was a bit more modest or less advanced than that. They had to climb up to a big mountain and then jumped off from there. So that was the second class of immortals who couldn't simply rise up from the middle of the town, but they had to climb up to a big mountain and then jump off from there. Now the third class of immortals is the most interesting one, because it's immortals who achieved immortality through death. Now that sounds a bit self-contradicting, doesn't it? Yes. Are the last ones the immortals who achieved immortality through death, by dying. They achieved immortality by dying. So that sounds a bit contradictory. But the thing is that, and it's quite an interesting thing that, let me see, yeah. It's related to Chinese alchemy, because the Chinese, in their pursuit of immortality, were also invented alchemy. Yes?
What religion are the Japanese?
What's about the Japanese, sorry?
What is their official religion in Japan? I don't know.
It is official?
Are they like Christian or you know what?
How is it related to the, I don't understand, but they usually have, in Japan, they usually have Shinto and Buddhism.
Okay, I didn't know that, thanks.
Okay, but we are talking about mainly about China. We are talking about mainly China, and China had the Chinese religion. Okay, this was a tricky question, I see. Okay. So, we are talking about China, and Chinese had the Chinese religion. It's difficult to categorize. You might call it Confucianism, but Confucianism was just a philosophic interpretation of it. So basically they believed they had their own pantheon of gods, they believed that their ancestors became gods, there were gods of